So welcome to all of you. My name is Matt. I use he, him pronouns. I'm from the LA Catholic Worker out here on the West Coast. So a little couple hours before many of you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Again, I'm going to invite folks, if you're not speaking or raising a question, go ahead and mute yourself using the button in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen with the little microphone, just because Zoom gets distracted when there's a lot of sounds coming from different screens. And if I see you're not muted, I may mute you and you can unmute yourself later. No, it's not personal, but just trying to make it so it's easier for folks to hear, because sometimes the audio distractions can be a little bit much for folks. So as we dive in today, we're starting with some heavy stuff. In the tragedy of the violence that led to last summer's uprisings, the United States was gifted with another invitation into racial consciousness. For many in the Catholic worker movement, it was not a new awareness, but maybe, hopefully, it reminded us of the never-ending responsibility that we have to explore the impacts of racism and white supremacy in our lives, in our relationships, in our culture, and in the larger structures and systems around us. I know for Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, and API Catholic workers, racism's insidious presence, even in movements like ours, is not something unknown. And for the numerous white Catholic workers like myself, we know these moments have brought hard conversations, challenging confrontations, and sometimes unresolvable confusion. But we have continued in the work because we are committed to refining our efforts, to exploring our structures, to creating the new in the shell of the old, and to a healing that includes us as well. We're not here today to debate the reality of structural racism, but to continue our efforts to grow and deepen our understanding of a system that, frankly, is hell-bent on disproportionately harming diverse communities of color, but one that also serves as a tool for a system that doesn't care about any of us. And so we come together to recognize that this is about a collective liberation effort. Sometimes in our work on the margins in this alternative way of living, I know I have forgotten that we can be a part of the same problems in the world that we fight against. And so we gather to consider how we can contribute and build a movement centered on anti-racism, to not only engage in racial justice work in our unique programs and services, but to be a living example of how to grow an unending commitment to practices and structures that liberate as well. We gather to expand what many, though not all of us, have already started around racial justice work, to share best practices, to look for creative ideas on how we grow our efforts, because our work is never done. And we gather knowing that part of this requires reparations for past harms. Now, when we use the term reparations, it often specifically relates to the work that has to be done on the systemic level. So by governments and by institutions whose policies and practices have created specific harms for different Black, Indigenous communities of color, and which have allowed oftentimes white communities to profit. But reparations type work is also required of us on a more local and personal level. Here in the Los Angeles area, for example, we at the Catholic Worker have to reckon with the reality that white supremacy has made it more likely that some of our supporters will donate to our work over the Black-led organizations doing incredible work here in Los Angeles. Additionally, many of the resources that are donated to us are available to our predominantly white donors because systems have stripped resources from non-white communities, while making the accumulation of wealth easier, although not always easy, to white communities. I say all of this just to say that we have work to do, both on the systemic level and on the community and individual levels, as we think about racial justice and reparations. I imagine you are here today because you have a similar feeling and sense of things. So thank you for making time to be here and joining us. We'll offer some resources at the end of today's call, some from both inside the Catholic worker movement, but also from the other movement partners and thought leaders who are really on the forefront of helping us explore our culpability and commit to new ways forward. On a logistical note, before I turn this over to our presenters today, as we move into our presentations, We know some of you will have to leave before the breakout rooms. We understand. But if you would please let me know by putting a note into the chat that just says you will be leaving early. That way I can arrange our breakout rooms and not have people exit and have too small of groups. So thank you for doing that. For now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker, Maria Berg, spent many years living and working with the Sukasa Catholic Worker and continues in their extended community network. Unfortunately, she was not able to be here in person, but has sent along a recording for us to watch, which we'll do momentarily. After that, we will have the lovely opportunity to hear from Carla Dawson, who is with us here today. Carla has lived with the Des Moines Catholic Worker had lived with the Des Moines Catholic Worker for 20 years, and now has been connected with the New York Catholic Worker on and off for the last 32 years. So a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience and insights that we'll have a chance to hear from. So first we'll hear from Maria. So I'm going to pull her video up and invite folks to listen in and hear from the wisdom of our friend.
I'm Maria Berg, and I've been a part of the extended Sukasa community for about 5 years. My time there has been split in two by a year-long sabbatical, and for the past year, I've lived in the neighborhood nearby. Sukasa Catholic Worker was originally called the Central American Martyrs Center, and it stands on Council of Three Fires territory land. That's land that was stolen from the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi people. And that's important for me to say as we come into Indigenous Peoples Day. It's also important for me to say it because it was founded to minister to people who had been a victim of the proxy war that was part of the Cold War, where we sent the CIA into Central and South America to terrorize people, frankly, as well as Afghanistan. We terrorized many people of color in order to resist communism. And that level of terror and interference continues to today and continues to express itself in forms of genocide and displacement and immigration that Sukasa continues to combat today as a place where predominantly people of color who speak English and Spanish can come to seek shelter. Sukasa's history, for those of you who don't know it, is broken into basically three main categories. The first 6 years, the founders, who are religious brothers and sisters who desired to live in solidarity and minister to people who'd been tortured, partnered with the Kovler Center, a place that pioneered torture treatment to provide healing modalities both in the house and at the center for a predominant Latin American families and singles. In 1997, policies shifted, fewer people showed up. It became more of a standard homeless shelter for whoever, whatever, however long. And then it became sort of a institutional nonprofit until about 2016 and took families, some fleeing domestic violence. In 2016, the racial justice era kind of begins more explicitly at Sukasa. It's always been an immigrant outreach in a Black neighborhood. It's always had a soup kitchen run by Frida, who's a Black woman from the neighborhood. The apocryphal story is that she asked Brother Dennis, who founded Sukasa, "What's a white man like you doing in my neighborhood?" It's funny how we as Catholic workers kind of stand out in the places we work often. And I say that was the beginning of the racial justice era at Sukasa because we made a lot of changes in 2016. The biggest one was to accept Black families. Basically, anybody who speaks English and Spanish at that point was welcome. And we also started to talk more explicitly about power dynamics. And there was a big turnover of workers around that time. And we had the opportunity to rethink our rules. And it seemed like from 2016 until 2020, we were rethinking and rewriting the rules about once every 6 months. New workers would come in and would see the rules and be shocked by them, or we'd have mini crises like happen in every house, and someone would say, well, this wouldn't have happened if the rules were this way. And I have to say that when I first entered the house, my biggest mission or thing that grated on me was that I was given a key to the door. And Margarita, who was a mother who'd lived there for most of a year, got to be let in by me for her own protection from a potentially abusive partner. But I couldn't help but think that there was something wrong with this. Like, I, as a white woman, was somehow empowered to be a gatekeeper, literally. Um, and the dream I had was that all of the doors would be thrown open, that everyone would have keys, that this would be a true place of freedom, and that we would find a way to do that within the mission of the house. Around the same time, the twin of this mission was that Let Us Breathe, which had been a partner of Emmaus House and a real leader of racial justice work on the West Side, was looking for a permanent space after their landlord had frankly kicked them out. And they chose because of their work, because the landlord was racist and did not want to be a party to racial justice work. So Sukasa had a spare building. Let Us Breathe needed a space. Folks from Emmaus House on the outside or on the board and myself worked together to find a way to open this space for Let Us Breathe. So now not only do we have kind of this questioning of power hierarchies in the house, we also have a neighbor who's facilitating a regional retreat for Midwest Catholic workers in 2017 on abolition and also like modeling abolitionist practices and doing abolitionist work in the neighborhood. And for a while, it was pretty quiet. It was like taking out their trash and doing maintenance on their building. Like that was how we supported them. And then 2020 happened. And this duality of internal house dialogue on power and external organizing work came to a little bit more of a head, I would say. Internally, there had been, while I was on sabbatical, I guess you'd say, traveling the world and being a Catholic worker in Rome and other places, and predominantly Minnesota, to be honest, the house had made a decision to shift away from rules altogether and go to a series of pillars. And these pillars were about nonviolence and mutual respect and conflict resolution and healing and like all high-minded, lovely, lofty ideals. And I was told that this was done in conjunction with the families and everyone had had participation and involvement and the decision had been a full consensus. But in the throes of the pandemic, it became clear that this wasn't quite true. If there was consensus at the time, it hadn't seemed important to some of the women and they didn't really feel like they'd be held to it and they didn't really feel like they would have to hold others to it. And I think the workers maybe felt the same way, quite frankly. I think we could say we all didn't feel like we'd really be held to it or that it was really that critical. And that lack of relationship and lack of truly understanding if this was what the families who lived with us, we call them families, not guests, because they often stay longer than our workers do. And we all have needs. We're all guests in some way. Our families may not have really needed this kind of lack of hierarchy, or maybe would have structured it differently. And this became the seed of a huge conflict that grew beyond the workers' ability to manage by ourselves. And we enlisted first our board and then Let Us Breathe in this work. And it continues to be a conflict in the house to today. The house has not taken on guests in over a year and has been in kind of a soul-searching, how do we move forward? Are we really as racist as we've been accused of being? How did this anti-racist work fall apart and fall so short for the women who live with us, who are of color and who dream of this being a home for a long term? How are their structures so falling so short? And at the same time, I and other Catholic workers from the house and not from the house are helping Let Us Breathe with the uprising of last year. So at the same time that we're like really being beaten up internally with our sense that we're not doing our work well, or that our striving and our intellectual exercise towards anti-racism isn't actually serving the people we intended it to serve. At the same time, we're, driving van loads of food and equipment across the city almost every other weekend or something for a summer, setting up tables, feeding people, helping moderate, cleaning up, putting things away, helping facilitate. My brother helped facilitate one of the police abolition Chicago defund CPD trainings. And um, you know, helping throw basically a bunch of block parties saying, we need to take care of each other. We need mutual aid. We don't need to be harmed by the police. And so that is really, I think, the struggle. Um, that is what has stuck with me is it is so easy, relatively speaking, to do the exterior work of showing up when we're asked to and um, hauling things around, giving away food, cooking food, whatever it is. It's easy to be an ally in public. And it's really, really hard. Um, it's the work of relationship. It's the work of making sure, checking in, really, truly being invested in each other's humanity and reality and life. And no one owes that to us as Catholic workers. No matter what we've done for a person of color doesn't owe us their labor, emotional or otherwise. And so how we continue to be relevant as a movement and what it means to be a truly anti-oppressive house is something that oftentimes eludes me to this day, and is one of the reasons why I now live down the street from a house and across the street from a house and not in a house, because it's really, really tough for me, having lived through the kinds of tense and difficult arguments that I've had, to truly believe that our movement is taking accountability for the harm that we cause, and to truly trust the people I'm working with, that they care and are seeking the right solutions, and also just to trust myself, coming from the background that I come from, that I am going to have the attention and the sensitivity necessary to do the work of anti-racism when I'm half asleep, when I'd rather not be in this meeting anymore, when I'm, worried about harm that's being caused. It's really, really a challenge. And so I'm grateful to engage in this conversation with all of you, even remotely, and hope that there will be many blessings on your work. Thank you.
Thanks to Maria, who is again not here, but for those thoughts and insights. And without further ado, I'd love to pass it on to Carla. So Carla, please feel free to unmute yourself and the floor is yours. The image right next to the one you just clicked, there's a camera and there's a microphone. I think you just hit the camera one. The far left button.
Yeah. I'd like to say this is my first Zoom meeting, but I'd be telling a dirty lie. Hi, everybody. For people who don't know, my name is Carla Dawson, and I go by Carla Dawson. Some people call me Miss Carla. Some people just call me Carla. Pronouns, she, her. Trying to be inclusive to other people's feelings and loves and needs. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. How about that? I have to correct Matt because maybe he didn't understand what I said. I came to the Des Moines Catholic Worker 32 years ago. I've been coming to Des Moines probably, I don't know, 24 years, however long Joanne's lived at the Catholic Worker in New York. So 32 years in the Catholic Worker movement. What I like to say is, when I came to the Catholic Worker 32 years ago, I was in need of housing. I had a 4-year-old son. I got a pamphlet. The Catholic Worker was on there. I called. They said they had a room. I came. Me and my boy lived there for a month. We moved up the street. We used to volunteer. We'd come back every day pretty much, and we'd help. That was in 1988. In 1989, I had my son Josh, my second boy, and the Catholic Workers had asked me if I would like to join their community. This was June. My boy was born on June 6th. I moved into the Des Moines Catholic Worker June 9th, 1989. Yeah, some of you might not even know 1989. It's like, what is 1989? It was 32 years ago. So I moved to the Des Moines Catholic Worker. The Catholic Worker community at that time was, which it mostly predominantly I'd say at the majority of the time, was predominantly Caucasian. I don't know the right terminology, white community. Um, myself, as you can see, I am a woman of color. I am African American. Um, there was a woman who lived there with me whose children were biracial, and another woman who lived there whose children were all white. So the Catholic worker at that time was three single women running the Des Moines Catholic Worker. As one of the founders of the Catholic Worker would say, I never thought in my life three women would run the Catholic Worker. Never let the Catholic Worker fool you about what can be done. A little bit after that, one of the women who lived with me, her daughter died, and so her and her two sons, they moved back to the farm. The other women, I'm not saying people's names because I didn't get permission to use their names, but if you look up the Des Moines Catholic Worker, you could see who they were. Another woman moved up the street and still was in touch with the Catholic Worker. She's one of my lifelong friends. We've been friends now for 34 years. So she moved up. She moved 3 blocks away from the Des Moines Catholic Worker. Um, I had another boy. He was my youngest boy. Jordan was born in December, 1990. So two of my sons are what you would call cradle Catholic workers. They never lived anywhere besides the Catholic worker. They were born at the Catholic. Well, they were born 2 blocks away from the Catholic worker. The hospital is 2 blocks from our house in Des Moines. So they are cradle Catholic workers. As time goes by, a lot of people coming and going. The Catholic worker as a place was one of the best places I could have ever raised my sons. I know people who live all over the world. I mean, literally all over the world. My sons were around people who are warm, caring, compassionate. Mind you, the vast majority of them were people who were white. But I never, in my mind, it's always in my mind about race. It's not like it's always in my mind. It's just part of life in the United States. But I never was worried about their safety, people treating them bad because they were little boys who were. My oldest boy is he's African American. My two younger boys are biracial. I never worried about them outside of the community. Not feeling good about being young black boys. So that never was really a point in my mind. But it always is in my mind when somebody would come to our door and then they'd be looking around and I'd be like, "Can I help you?" And they'd look at me. I'm like, "Oh, they must be new to the Catholic worker. They don't know I've been here for however many years." And so that usually that would I'd be like, "Okay, newbie. They don't know." Um, so that and that jarring every once in a while is good. It shock you into reality that I would say that probably 70, 75, 80% of the people who came to the Des Moines Catholic Worker were African American or Latino. So when they walk into a community and most of the people are not African American, at sometimes, at the majority of the time at the Des Moines Catholic Worker, I was the only African American in the community. So to look around and see that most of the people who are being served by the Catholic Worker were African American always puts you in a weird dynamic. But it had never really it the first time it really resonated in my mind as when I went myself, Joanne, and my three boys went to LA to visit Joanne's sister. My kids are roughly the same age as Joanne's sister's kids. And she took me to the LA Catholic Worker. I'm standing at the LA Catholic Worker and I'm looking down the block. And as far as I could see, I saw nothing but black men standing on that line. Then in my soul, I knew something's not right. I knew then that the world we lived in has been set up to make, it's been set up to make Black people feel unwelcomed, unwanted, unloved, uncherished, and undervalued. But I also knew that in my day to day life, what I was doing, how I was living my life, was uplifting not only to myself and to my community, but to the community I lived in, the larger community, and to the world. But also, when you are somewhere and you see that, and it's, I mean, it's smack dab in your face, there's no other way around it. You're like, hmm. And like 4 years ago, my pastor said to me, and this was eye opening to me, he said, Carla, the system is not broken. He said, the system is working just fine. He said, the system was set up to work just like it's working now. I want everybody to think about that. The systems that we live in were set up for white people to be in charge of African Americans and anybody who is of color. It's not broken. It was never set up for me to be in the elite group of people. So it's not broken. But also, I know in me, the Jesus that I serve is a Jesus of color. I know that might be surprising to some people. Get over it. For Jesus to be who he was, he had to be a man of color. So I know in myself that Catholic, not Catholic, I don't care. The Jesus I follow is a brown man. So when I came back from New York, and then me and Joanne came back from LA. Me and Joanne went to visit. Then me and Joanne went to visit New York, and I'm like, hey, hip hop happening, and the New Yorkers were like, oh, maybe she wants to come to New York. I'm like, no, I don't. I'm like, I'm good in Iowa, but Joanne over here, she's thinking about New York. So we came back. Joanne was with us 3.5 years, I think, pretty close to 3.5 years. It seemed like 25 minutes, but hey, that's how time does you. So Joanne moved on, and a lot of people who I've seen on here have came to the Des Moines Catholic Worker, been community members at the Des Moines Catholic Worker. Um, I'm trudging along. In the early 90s, the Catholic Worker in Des Moines was a house of sanctuary for Central American men. So my two youngest boys spoke Spanish before they spoke English. So that's what I mean about people all over the world. My kids had the best training of how to be in spaces where you not only you are in the majority and you are in the minority. Because in the house that we lived in, everybody spoke Spanish and was of color. And then we could go across the alley, and everybody there was who were Catholic workers were Caucasian people, and some of them knew Spanish, some of them did not. But all the people who would come to the house were people. Majority of people were people of color. So time goes by. My boys are growing up. They're getting bigger. Ornery is all get out. Um, if anybody has ever been around little boys, they're ornery. Just saying. That's just the way. Not little girls are ornery too. Don't get it twisted. I got 3 granddaughters, and they're kind of ornery. But so around, I don't know. I can't remember. It was around. It was 2000. I want to say 2009. 2000. So around 2006, 2007. I had been working. All the time that I was a Catholic worker, except 4 years, I had either a part-time or full-time job. I worked 2 blocks down at the elementary school, and then I worked in Head Start, and then I went and worked at the high school. All the time, mind you, I'm a Catholic worker, I'm a mom, and I was going to school, and I worked. And I would take a class almost only like 2 semesters out of 10 years that I didn't take a class. So I was going to school, working, being at the Catholic worker. And then I got an opportunity to go to school full time, quit my full time job, go to school and get my degree in education to become a teacher. When you're offered a full ride school to a private university, you got to take it, just so you know. Because I was making like $15,000, $16,000 a year. One year at the college that I went to cost $42,000. There's no way to round how you do that math. That's higher math than I know. That's actuary math. Don't get it. So I was going to school full time, still taking houses at the Catholic Worker. So like in 2008, I stepped back from most of my stuff doing at the Catholic Worker. Most doing that, I was focused on school, doing really well, so I could graduate. Around that time, our neighborhood was really, really changing. People were moving in and moving out. A lot of the neighborhood, the neighborhood my kids grew up in was one of the diverse neighborhoods you can get. We had people of Asian descent, people of African descent, people of Latino descent. Everybody lived in that neighborhood. If you're talking about a fruit salad in terms of people, it was a fruit salad. Everybody was in that neighborhood. Um, my Mind you, my sons are growing older and older and older. Um, and so around this time, they were being ornery, steal the van, things like that. Um, a neighbor across the street had a Confederate flag that he waved. He left it in front of his house, right across the street from my house. For it had been up there like a year or two. Nobody was saying too much about it until we found out that he was a bomber. He had placed bombs all over the city and tried to blow people up. So we're like, oh, not so good. Um, then it was in probably like in February, probably like in February, January, maybe January of 2010. No, he was born 2009. So this would have been 2000. Yeah, this would begin the beginning of 2009. Um, Community members came to me and they said, Carla, we would like your sons to leave the Catholic Worker. I'm like, oh, okay. We had been talking about this for like a year or two. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I said, I'll be leaving too. And they're like, no, 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 you don't have to leave. I'm like, yeah, 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 I do have to leave. I'm like, they're my sons. And I will leave if you're asking them to leave. And they're like, no, 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 you don't have to leave. I said, you don't understand. My sons were born and raised at the Catholic Worker. If you're asking them to leave, then you're asking me to leave. And they're like, no, no, no. I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. So that August, I graduated from college in um, May, and in August, I moved out of the Des Moines Catholic Worker. Um, and I've only been back 3 times in 12 years. And what I'd like other people on the Zoom to know, my boys are Catholic workers. And to have somebody who has known you through good and bad, through a major heart attack, through a mom dying, through all these things, to ask you, to make you feel like your kids, who they've known their whole lives, are no longer welcome in a community, is the worst thing that could happen to somebody. So I know everybody on here is trying to do their best. I get it. I'm a Catholic worker. I get it. But I have a few quotes I'd like you to take in mind while you go to your small breakout rooms. It is not inclusion. If you invite people into a space, you are unwilling to change. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. That's Maya Angelou. And this last one, white supremacy, whatever word you like to replace with supremacy, won't die until white people see it as a white issue they need to solve rather than a black issue they need to empathize with. All my life that I've been a Catholic worker, I came to the Catholic worker when I was 22 years old. I live out the call of the Catholic worker. I walk humbly with Jesus. I do right by my neighbor. I feed people when they're hungry. I will give people the clothes off my back, the things that I want. And I live by the golden rule. I do not do anything to somebody that I would not want done to myself. And if we all try to do that, this world will be a lot better. But you first, as the lady who said before me, you have to start with yourself. You start working on yourself to be the best person you can be. And then you work with another person, a small group, your Catholic worker, your community, and you work out and you work out and you work out. And one thing I have to say, I have been blessed by the Catholic worker, more blessed than any blessings I've ever been to anybody. And I'd like to say because I live what I believe. Last year, there's a group of Catholic Peace Ministries. The director of the Catholic Peace Ministries is a former Catholic worker, Patty McKee. She called me and she said, Carla, the Catholic Peace Ministries would like to offer to give you the Bishop Dingman Peace Award. For people who don't know, Bishop Dingman was a man who lived, walked, and talked what he believed. That to me is a blessing and an honor that I did not feel like I deserved because I was just living my life. But the community I lived in thought it was a big enough deal to offer me to be the recipient of that award. If you live into your light, your life will be fine. And I would like to thank everybody for listening to what I had to say. And I'm not going to a small group, but I'll be back when you come back, I guess. I don't know how that works, but okay. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. And have a good Sunday afternoon.
Thank you so much, Carla. So appreciate you. Yep, that wisdom, that love, that care. We have a lot to think about and talk about. So we're going to be going to small breakout rooms for 25 minutes. You'll have groups of 5 or 4 folks. Invite you each to take about 5 minutes to share. I'm going to drop in the chat the 2 questions that we've invited you to reflect on, but I would even more encourage you to take the reflections of Carla and see what they mean in light of your experience. So those 2 questions were, what changes has your community made to address the issues of systemic racism within your houses as well as the greater community? And the second question you might choose to engage is, what changes would you like to see happen but have not yet been able to realize? When we return, we're going to do about a 3-minute share out. And so I invite you to think of who in your group is going to be the person who does that. And if they want to jot down some notes without using people's names, we want to come back and gather best practices and ideas for how we move forward. So I will send you to rooms now, and we'll see you back here in about 25 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Remind you to mute yourself as you come on in. Want to be respectful of folks' time today. I think we are all back. Great. So I'm going to read off your group number and who's in the group. And if whoever was in that group wants to unmute themselves and share with us for about 2 minutes or so, some of the big things that came up in your conversation, we'd love to hear it. So Room 1 was Dave, Hallie, Isaiah, and Sarah. So if anybody want to start us off.
Matt, just a clarification. Are we recording this part?
Yes, and the sharebacks were going to be recorded. But yeah, we invite you not to share names if it feels like it was private stuff. Thank you.
Are you going to post them, Matt, or are you just recording them for like note taking?
What would we prefer? I was intending to post them as learnings to share back, but if that feels like not the way we want to go, I'm happy to not post it and type up notes and send the notes out, if that feels like a better use.
I have nothing to hide, but I did use a lot of expletives in our roundtable. So if you can maybe delete some of them.
Oh, I'm sorry. Your small groups were not recorded.
Okay, thank you, Jesus.
It's just
okay.
this shareback piece. Okay, yeah.
Okay, group one, some of the changes that we have made, we're trying to learn hospitality all the time. We're trying to avoid paternalism and challenge the paternalistic attitude that we just seem to inherently have. We want to accompany the families that live there, live in the casa, and the people who stay in our Catholic worker communities more than to tell them what to do. Things we would like to see changed, we'd like to see more people of color on our board. In my community, we only have 1 or 2 Spanish speakers, and all of the families that have lived there usually have been Spanish speaking. So that becomes the language barrier becomes an issue. I like this. Somebody said there's a sense of liberation in not being able to do everything, which I have to kind of remind myself all the time. And we want to have a changing relationship with the police throughout the larger community, and maybe have some sort of alternative community crisis response. And then generally speaking, have a board that is more reflective of the community.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dave.
Okay.
And there'll be a chance at the end for any last thoughts. So if anything gets missed, someone can just jot it down and we'll come to it. Room 2 is Brian, Daniel, Lincoln, and Shelley.
All right, I can just share some few thoughts, and if anyone wants to add to it from my group. I think one thing that came about, or one thing that was in the discussion, was the need for clear expectations within a community, that clear, and openness, clear communication, and how important that can be for especially tackling things such as racism. The willingness to change quote from Carla was talked about, and we might use the language of conversion that as we continue this work, it does require change of us, and and classical religious language, we would say there's a need for conversion. Talked about how difficult different communities have had this discussion at different times, and for some communities, it's even led to members leaving to avoid this discussion. Not that they were, just because this discussion was too painful to talk about in the open. We discussed, like in Milwaukee, we do try to have, do short-term hospitality, and we talked about, we do regular either weekly or bi-weekly guest meetings to make sure that there's regular feedback, and that we're really being intentional and hearing the needs of families as they're staying with us, and discussed some communities doing intentional redirection, when particularly if they have excess funds. And we did discuss a little bit the discussion of keys, and how there's a variety of thoughts on that topic, but also noting that no matter what a community is doing with keys, there's always going to be a power dynamic that needs to be recognized that goes beyond. The keys might be the kind of a simple way to focus and make it the lightning rod, but to be aware of the other ways that the power dynamics there, just from even who gets to come there when an opening arises.
Thank you, group 2. Group 3 was Claire, Martha, Mary Beth, and Michael.
Group 3, do we have anybody reporting? Hello.
You go ahead, Claire.
Okay, well, I talk too much. In terms of the 2 questions, we didn't address them mostly because our situations are rather modest. So in the case of the Philly house, it's Joe, Mary Beth and Joanna that are sort of there doing the hospitality, and Scott and I are doing the hospitality as we can, and Mike is on a farm. So I have to say we didn't address them explicitly in the context of hospitality. I got off a little bit on a not a rant, but kind of saying that for my experience in doing peace education here in the city, it's with people of color that I have found the most simpatico in conversations about nonviolence. And I don't want to romanticize, that description. I just came from a circle training in August. Most of the facilitators were people of color. And so just feeling that kind of like I'm with people for whom there isn't this indifference or loneliness or mystification when you try to talk about a more nonviolent world or a more nonviolent way of doing things. There's, in fact, I'm learning from, the facilitator, young facilitators, new approaches. And then I started to rant about, we were talking about gun violence, and I said, yes, you can look at it through a race lens, but it's also this addiction and devotion that we have as Americans to the armed way, and that the voices who have been the clearest, often challenging it, are people of color. And I'm pointing to Barbara Lee, who was the lone voice against the Iraq War. The representative, she's since the 92s, she's out of Illinois, I think. She's like continually said, why in this investment in nuclear weapons? So I don't want to go on about this, but I do encourage us to think in this moment where we are in shift to, in addition to this conversation, share what we're learning, because the indigenous voices that are speaking on this climate crisis, I'm learning from these women, so I feel that as a Catholic worker, I don't feel like I'm teaching them. I feel like, all right, what can I do to help you? Or, let me be in solidarity. Your framing here is so helpful in this season of confusion, so how can we link? Because there's some just terrific insights that are coming from these different communities. And the last thing, if everyone can read Deming's essay about the walk she took in Tennessee to challenge nukes. This was in '68, and it was a walk across the state of Tennessee, and everybody said you cannot mix the civil rights struggle with saying peace with the Soviet Union. And this group walks, and they're predominantly white, one lone black man, but they go into these black churches, and those people talk about hospitality, they are the ones who open their door the most at the greatest risk. It's a really magnificent American story about, anyway, enough.
Thank you so much, and so much to learn. Appreciate it, Claire. All right, our group 4, Donna, Heather, and Paul. Looks like you 3 are left in that group.
We also had Kateri, so there were 4 of us. Heather, would you be willing to talk on our behalf?
I didn't take good enough notes.
Didn't either.
You go
Whatever
for it,
you all
Donna.
remember is perfect.
Yeah, I didn't take any notes. I don't think I'm qualified to do this. We shared our perceptions of our own houses. Kateri and Paul and I did, and our awareness that there's systemic racism in the Catholic worker movement and that our communities reflect that. It was a great gift to have Heather with us. I want to say that. She has been building anti-racism materials and programs, and she gave us our website, her website, which I hope she will share with all of you. I very much look forward to learning from what she has to offer.
Thank you all, group 4. Group 5, we have Dawn, Leah, Sarah, and Theo. We're still here.
We didn't really talk about who was going to share. Who wants to share?
You, Theo, you were the brilliant one.
Well, I'll share, but I'm not going to claim to be brilliant. I don't know. We had talked about a lot of things. Why do our communities look as they do, race-wise, class-wise? What does it mean to look the way we do, going into communities that are not necessarily ours, and what does it mean to be there? We talked about like kind of acknowledging the way other people who don't call themselves Catholic workers do the Catholic worker, just because. So like, maybe it's like a need more of white folks to like relearn what community is, and like, can we acknowledge like mutual aid exists informally outside of like an institution or ideology like the Catholic worker? Maybe they're doing the same thing if they're letting their neighbors sleep on their couch. That's hospitality. Or resisting militarization of the police is doing the Catholic worker. And so like, how can we acknowledge that? How can we support those folks? And I mean, that was a topic too of like, what resources can we share? Either like financially or ourselves and our time and stuff like that, and support the work that is like very similar to ours that does already exist out there. Thanks.
It was brilliant.
Thanks, Theo, in group 5. And our last group 6, Laura, Catherine, Joanne, and Rosalie.
Well, I'll share a few themes that ran through our conversation and invite others from the group to give more of a summary if they like. In our kind of justice and anti-racism efforts, willingness to change, to take risks, to try things, and to explore partnerships, something we talked about. Think about who wants to do the work to keep the house going, and attributed to Dorothy, this quote, "Do the work and the community will follow." And the view of the Catholic worker as having an ethos, or perhaps of attracting white people because it's a repentance movement. And I cede to others in the group if you'd like to add more.
I wish Catherine would do the story she was just about to do when we got cut off about her Dominican order, if she's willing.
That would be great. I also want to point out that one of the words that I took away from our discussion is responsibility. I think that's a very important part of personalism.
My earlier sharing was saying that I'm a rather new member to the Casa Latina Catholic Worker House, which is part of a complex in Louisville, in Old Louisville, which is attached to a church, which many of the workers are involved in turning into a cultural center. And then next to another center, which is also founded by a member of the former Catholic, was a former Catholic worker, called La Casita, La Casita, excuse me. And they do job placement, legal services, food, and so on. So the whole complex is sort of, and so on. So we talk about that, and that we are involved right now in having a series of retreats. We've had one, we have 2 others planned, and Dave is very much a part of that planning. And then finally, we got to the questions of reparations and so on. And I just, as a parting shot, and I think that's what Joanne was alluding to, is I mentioned that I am a Dominican, and then in the year 2000, we have a very large African-American Catholic component in Louisville, because in the early 1800s, and my community was founded in 1822, we were getting prepared for our 200th anniversary. But the African-American community in what's called the Kentucky Holy Land is very, very large in the city of Louisville now. But in the year 2000, which is over 20 years ago, the Sisters of Charity in the Catholic Holy Land, the Sisters of Loretto, again, Central Kentucky, what they call the Catholic Holy Land, and the Dominican Sisters, again, Central Kentucky, the Catholic Holy Land, called upon all of the parishes of Louisville and counties all from Central Kentucky up to Louisville, and wrote to students of all our schools and so on, and brought them to Bardstown, which was one of the first 4 dioceses, as some of you know, in the United States. And we made a public apology. And we have not done any formal reparations, some giving of scholarships and things of that nature, and a great openness to having, you know, and I'm not going to say our partners, but the community, the African-American community for each of those 3 congregations know how much we love them and how much they're part of us and so on. And I'm part of a mentor team to our associates program, and we have some very wonderful African-American associates. But that's what you caught me saying, Joanne, that there are some of us who are so aware of what we need to repent about.
And I just applaud you for taking responsibility for having been slaveholding congregations. I think there's a lot more of that in the history of the United States than most people will admit. And the fact that you were willing to do it and own it publicly and take steps of whatever kind to start making reparations is
right. My community happens to be one of 8 that joined together 10 years ago. In the celebrations of the 200th, all of those communities, which are not all 200 years old, are coming together. But one of the communities, one of the committees is what's called the local committee. And it's going in depth into the African-American diaspora and our ongoing work and relationship with them, and a play, etc. So we know what we owe. We just have to do more.
Thank you, Catherine.
More.
So in this last minute, we're going to close with just a few items. One is these are just prompts for further conversations and work. Our work doesn't end with these sessions, so please take them home with you and see where they go. We'll be putting a number of resources in the follow-up email. I've just dropped 4 that have been named as helpful in different spaces. I encourage you to find them. Our next and final roundtable will be on November 14th, the importance of farming communities in a time of climate change. 1/3 of Peter's vision for the worker movement was about farms, so invites you to come and join us. There's going to be conversations about whether we resume these sessions in the spring. So if there's something you might be interested in supporting or helping with, we would love your help in making them happen. I'm going to drop a link into the chat that will come through the email as well. That's to give us some feedback on how these electronic university series were, so we can learn from them and do better as we go. And finally, I know that in the email I sent out, I put the wrong link for our last session. So if anyone wants to see the last session that we did, I've just dropped it in the chat. But otherwise, thank you so much to Maria and Carla for your wisdom and insight and life. We continue our work to do better for our sake and for all those who've been a part of our tradition and family. I'll stick around for another half an hour if anyone wants to be here, share some more ideas and thoughts, but wanting to respect your time tonight, we'll close out. And thanks everyone for being here and for being vulnerable in this messy, complicated work. But we'll get where we need to together. Take care.
Thanks, Catholic workers.
Thanks, Carla. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like.
Thank you.